All right, guys. So today we're going to be exploring a very critical and very important topic. That's going to be covering intimate partner violence and crisis intervention strategies. So my goal here is just to offer an overview of what intimate partner violence is, also known as IPV, what it looks like, and how we can meaningfully respond to it. So, especially in moments of crisis, is what we're going to be focusing on. So, whether you're coming to this presentation as a future mental health professional, an advocate, a community member, or someone who just seeks to develop a deeper personal understanding of what IPV is and how it affects people in our communities, this discussion is meant to inform and empower. Okay, so IPV is basically it's a global issue and it has devastating personal consequences. And addressing it requires empathy, it requires strategy, coordination across all sectors of our society. Okay, so my name is Tim Johnson, and this is my presentation on intimate partner violence and crisis intervention strategies. Okay, so let's get down to the brass tacks. Um, First, we're going to be defining IPV. We're going to understand its scope and then the different forms that it can take. From there, we're going to look at its physical, its emotional, and its financial impacts. We're also going to be exploring reasons why leaving an abusive relationship is very difficult. Even when somebody wants to, it is not always easy to do or possible to do. Um, and we'll shift into crisis intervention strategies and how we can help survivors in real time. Finally, we're going to talk about long term support, recovery, the role of empowerment. This presentation is basically going to wrap up with a brainstorming activity that is designed to kind of help us reflect on what we learned today and then also just kind of contribute to solutions for the future. Okay. So let's talk about what IPV actually is, okay, and what that looks like. Intimate partner violence refers to any behavior by a current or former partner that causes physical, sexual, emotional, or psychological harm. It's not limited to hitting and yelling. It can be silent, it can be manipulative, and it can be gradual, such as isolating a person from their family or controlling how they spend their money or constantly undermining their confidence. One partner seeks to dominate and control the other, often using fear. They're going to use guilt, they're going to use shame, they're going to use force. Okay. And it's not only women who are experiencing IPV, although women and gender diverse people are disproportionately affected. Uh, but this is an issue that crosses genders, it crosses races, it crosses classes, and it crosses borders. Okay, so one thing I'd really like to do here is sort of provide you guys with some hard hitting facts, some things that are really going to take this and put it into perspective. Um, so below, I kind of referenced a study that was it reviewed over 2 million women across 161 countries. Okay, and as a result, about 27% of ever partnered women aged 15 to 49 reported experiencing intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Okay, that's more than 1 in 4. And what's even more alarming is that the violence often started very young. 24% of these women aged 15 to 19 had already experienced IPV by the time they had turned 15 years old. Okay, these aren't just statistics, they represent lived experiences of fear and trauma and survival that have been happening all around the globe. Okay, so intimate partner violence at this point, we should all know that it's not a private matter. Okay. It's a major public health crisis that affects millions of people all over the world. And whether you believe it or not, it's affecting you too. Okay. So this burden doesn't just fall on the individual, it falls on families. Or I'm sorry, it doesn't just fall on the individual or their families. It extends into our healthcare systems, our workplaces, our schools, our economy. Everything that we know in society is affected by IPV. Okay. Survivors often require emergency medical care, long term mental health services, and housing support. Children who witness violence are more likely to struggle academically and repeat the cycle of abuse later in life. So, despite this, global progress toward reducing intimate partner violence, it's happening too slow, right? The same large scale study that I mentioned on the earlier slides that covered 161 countries found that while the issue is very well documented, Many governments are still not meeting their commitments to preventing IPV from happening. Um, Furthermore, this study also emphasized that although we know what works, um, such as in investing in prevention, investing in education, and investing in survivor services, these efforts remain extremely underfunded. They're inconsistently applied across the board. So addressing IPV effectively requires us to move away from just legal reform, and we have to take a much more coordinated approach to long-term commitment across all sectors. What's become clear in recent years is that IPV is not just a background issue, it's a persistent crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic intensified existing violence in many homes, revealing just how fragile and undersupported survivors can be during times of stress and isolation. We can no longer afford to treat IPV as a secondary issue. It requires urgent, coordinated, and multi-sectoral action that includes healthcare, justice, housing, education, and much more. While IPV doesn't always follow the same sort of patterns, there are often early warning signs that suggest a higher risk of violence down the line that we as professional mental health counselors should be aware of. Things like extreme jealousy, emotional manipulation, controlling behaviors, or even monitoring someone's cell phone or social media use can be a precursor to a more serious sort of abuse behind closed doors. Sometimes these behaviors are brushed off as signs of love or concern, but they often signal a need for control. A recent study explored how reliable these kinds of warning signs really are. Research looked at which behaviors early on were statistically linked to later acts of violence, and their findings confirmed that patterns like isolation, verbal threats, and possessiveness can, in fact, help us identify when someone is in danger, often before the first act of physical violence ever takes place. Okay, so one thing that I really want to point out here is that IPV reaches far beyond the moment that the initial abuse will occur. Survivors are going to live with ongoing fear, anxiety, trauma. Um, these are going to affect all aspects of their life. Many develop mental health conditions like PTSD, depression, substance use disorders. Others are going to struggle long term with isolation, difficulty trusting others in the future, possible homelessness. The toll is very personal and it ripples through families, it ripples through communities. It's something that we should take active measures to prevent. Okay, so physically, survivors are going to suffer injuries. All right, they're going to range from bruises to broken bones to long-term health issues like chronic pain or reproductive issues or gastrointestinal issues. Okay, physiologically, the impacts can be equally severe. I'm sorry, psychologically. Survivors are often going to experience intense fear. They're going to experience nightmares, numbness, constant state of hypervigilance. Um, these aren't just emotional reactions, all right? They're neurological responses to trauma, and they can last long after a relationship ends. In many abusive relationships, financial control is a key weapon. Survivors may be prevented from working, have their bank accounts monitored, or be denied access to their basic financial resources. This creates a level of dependency that makes leaving extremely difficult. Among college students, research shows that IPV is linked to academic stress and underperformance, especially when financial abuse is involved. Economic disempowerment keeps people trapped, not because they want to stay, but because they can't afford to leave. So even when a survivor leaves a relationship, the effects don't always necessarily end because that relationship ended. So many experience lingering trauma that's going to make it difficult for them to trust others and develop healthier connections in the future. Um, Although this can also be a motivator for survivors to seek help from family members, legal systems, support organizations. Um, it just acts as a reminder that recovery isn't passive, right? Many survivors actively work to heal. They got to rebuild and they work hard to protect themselves and they need our assistance. So one of the most harmful questions that people can ask is why didn't they just leave? Right? And the truth is leaving an abusive partner is arguably one of the most dangerous and complicated decisions that a survivor of IPV can face. Fear of violence, losing custody of a child, possible homelessness, retaliation from the abuser. All these things keep the survivor stuck. And, for many, the emotional manipulation and the trauma bonding make it incredibly hard to break free of that, even when they want to. Study in the UK looked specifically at South Asian women who had experienced IPV after choosing their own partner. Unlike in an arranged marriage, these women had exercised agency in selecting their partner. Yet, when the relationship became abusive, many of them lost family support. Their choice was used against them, and it became a barrier to leaving their partner. The study highlighted how cultural norms around honor, shame, and responsibility actually acted as a trap to keep survivors in painful situations. In that same study, nearly every participant described feeling responsible for their abuse because they had chosen their partner. They believed they had to live with the consequences of their actions. This self blame led to deep isolation. Instead of seeking help, many just stayed silent, convinced that they had no right to ask for support. The emotional burden of the guilt became as heavy as the abuse itself. Another highlight from this study is that cultural pressure really plays a major role too. Many women remained in harmful situations because they feared the shame that their families would experience or being judged by their communities. And in some of these cases, they endured abuse as a way of preserving honor. This sense of obligation to their family, to their reputation, and to their traditions, it kept them tied to people that were actively harming them. One of the most difficult things that can happen to a survivor is when they lose contact with their family. They also lose key support systems. Many of the women in the study have been cut off by their parents after entering a relationship their family didn't approve of in the first place. Without that safety net, leaving became even more difficult. And the fear of being ostracized by a larger community added another layer of pressure to stay with their abuser. So what's actually striking is, at the beginning of this course, we talked about paradox, right, and how that emerges in crisis intervention. So here's one: choosing a partner, right? That's often seen as a form of independence. But however, in this study that I just referenced, women became trapped once abuse occurred. So unlike those arranged marriages, these women felt that they couldn't go back to their families or their communities for support. So their original act of agency of choosing a partner made it harder to access help later on, creating a sort of invisible cage, creating a paradox. It's a little bit of a drum roll here. Now that we've sort of discussed what IPV is, and I've given you guys some background and some hard hitting facts, kind of bringing things into perspective, now I want to talk about crisis intervention strategies. When someone's in the midst of a crisis, our first job is to help them feel safe and seen. Crisis intervention isn't about solving everything, and by all means, most problems we can't solve for them. It's about slowing things down, offering emotional support, and helping the person regain a sense of control over their own situation. Survivors are often overwhelmed or frozen by fear, and our role is to help them move from that panic to a state of possibility. Okay, so in IPV cases, crisis support focuses on minimizing trauma while stabilizing the immediate situation. This might mean helping someone make a safety plan, talking through their options, or simply sitting with them as they process what's happening. It's important to avoid judgment. Even if the survivor isn't ready to leave, they still deserve the care and the validation that we would give to anybody else. Okay, so in these sort of situations, it's really easy for a survivor to feel lost and overwhelmed, right? So that's why we have a 6-step crisis intervention model. This will give us a clear way to support somebody during those moments in a step-by-step sort of process. It starts by understanding what that person is going through. That means listening to them, not just to the facts, but we need to understand how they're feeling in this situation. How are they perceiving their own crisis? How can we see it through their eyes? Once we understand the issue, the next step is safety. Okay. We have to make sure that the person and anyone else involved is out of immediate danger. That could mean talking through a safety plan, assessing whether someone's at risk of hurting themselves or others. Okay. Then we're going to transition into a third step, which is the emotional support, creating that space where they feel seen and heard and respected, and they feel that they can open up to you. Just being present and validating their feelings and showing empathy a lot of times can go a long way. It can help them regain their footing. After that, we're going to explore alternatives. Okay. So we're going to ask questions like what options are available right now? What sort of coping strategies have worked before? Are there people or services that can offer support? This is about helping the survivor think about possibilities, um, things that they maybe haven't considered while they're in survival mode. Okay. So then it's time to make a concrete plan. So this might include a safety plan to go to or a safe place that they can go to, someone to call, steps to regain financial and emotional stability. The key here is just to be realistic, practical, build around what the survivor feels like they are ready to do. All right. And then finally, we're going to get commitment from them. That doesn't mean that we're going to force any decisions. Um, we're really just here to help the survivor feel a sense of agency again by affirming their ability to take action in small ways and support them from the beginning of their recovery journey. So this model doesn't, rush that process, but it does give structure and time. It can feel chaotic for both parties. So just being calm and being present and helping them through it can make all the difference. Okay, so the most effective crisis work is going to be survivor centered. And all that means is that we're just validating the person's experiences, we're avoiding placing any blame on them, and we're remaining culturally aware at all times, right? So you don't need to show up with all the answers. All you do need to do is show up with empathy and humility, right? And when the survivor feels heard and respected, they're more likely to engage in this healing process with you. Okay, so I'm really not trying to rush through this, but I have gone over my 15 minutes of like actual talking on discussion by about almost 2 minutes now. So I kind of want to hurry this up. Um, but essentially, what I want to say here is that crisis care is the beginning, right? But it must lead into something more. Survivors need access to long-term support, and that's our thing. That's where we come in. So trauma counseling, peer groups, legal advocacy, housing assistance, you name it. Recovery is not linear, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight. So by connecting the immediate interventions with ongoing care, we're going to help survivors rebuild and not just survive. Okay, so precursor, this next section is kind of where we're going to talk about long-term support and recovery, and that's where we're going to also do our brainstorming activity, right? So this is where I kind of wanted everybody to kind of take a minute to think about, ways in which we can give back, ways in which we can support people in their long-term recovery. So without further ado, let's kind of jump into this whole situation. Okay, so I apologize. I went over on my actual discussion by about a minute and 30. So that kind of cuts into our brainstorming activity, but we're just going to roll with it. So as we close, I'm just inviting you to kind of reflect on this whole experience. What role can you play in preventing IPV, supporting someone in a crisis? Maybe you can challenge victim blaming language or learn more about local services or simply check on someone who seems isolated. Every act of awareness makes a difference. Change doesn't always start with a system. It often starts with just a single voice saying, I believe you. Okay. So one thing that I really want us to do right now, collectively, is we're going to brainstorm, right? So down here at the bottom of my screen, you can see it says beyond safety, what do survivors of IPV need for long-term recovery? Okay, so for the sake of the argument, we're just going to go based off of my brainstorming. So one thing that we've brainstormed here, hopefully after this presentation, is trauma-informed counseling and support, right? So survivors are going to benefit from trauma-informed counseling in safe communities. Providing emotional support and long-term recovery is key, right? Then hopefully we're thinking economic empowerment, right? Because we know that financial abuse is still within the realm of IPV. So access to job training, financial independence is vital for survivors to sort of rebuild and regain their confidence in life. Okay. Lastly, we're going to see sustained healthcare and legal aid. Ongoing healthcare, legal assistance, and social networks foster resilience and promote lasting and healing for survivors long term. Okay. So a few more brainstorming. Here we go. So, valuable assistance, what does that look like? Local organizations provide essential resources and support survivors. So that's how we're going to help them navigate their journey of recovery, right? So that's going to be our job is to provide them with resources, obviously. Next, we're going to be fostering connections. So peer groups that are a great way to create sort of safe spaces for individuals to share experiences, foster meaningful connections, and understand, you know, experiences that have been lived through other survivors. Okay. Building resilience, right? So through shared experiences and support, the community networks help individuals build that resilience and that confidence during recovery to take charge again over their lives and, sort of rebuild from the ashes. Okay, guys, sorry. So I've definitely gone over my time now by a minute. I do apologize, but I'm trying to kind of power through this a little bit. So, last little portion of our brainstorming activity, let's just jump right in. So, obviously, I said at the beginning we were going to talk about the importance of empowerment. So, hopefully, that's something that you guys also brainstormed as well. Empowerment plays a crucial role in recovery, right? For victims to enable them to regain control of their lives, essentially. Skill development, right? We want to set them up with programs that are going to help them learn new abilities, gain confidence, get their independence back. That's part of our job. Lastly, education leads to self-sufficiency, right? So education is a key component of being self-sufficient. So if we provide victims with the knowledge they need to rebuild their lives, then they can do it more effectively. All right, guys, that is my presentation. I appreciate you listening to me. Sorry I went over on my time. I do think that this is a really important topic, so I hope that you guys got something out of it and enjoy the brainstorming activity. Hopefully, you guys came up with something cool that maybe I didn't think of. So, yeah, I appreciate you. Thanks.